All right. All right, we are back. This is Computer Science S76. So there weren't too many questions from you, so that means it's my turn to start asking questions. Last week we started talking about MVC, which, how about we'll start with the softball, stands for what? Model View Controller. Okay, so what is the controller in that acronym? Brains of the application. So it's the code that you write, the so-called business logic that governs the control of your application. It's the entry point to really the logic that you write. All right, how about the view? Yeah, so interactions with the user. So view typically deals with presentation, both the aesthetics thereof, so how you're displaying information to the user, and then it typically has some UI mechanisms like buttons and text fields and whatnot that somehow send messages back to which of the letters? The controller. So you have this bidirectional arrow essentially between your C and your V, so the two are talking, but you do not have an arrow between, say, V and M directly. Rather, the model is where you typically represent your data. And we'll do a simple example tonight of what you might want to model with its own class that we write ourselves. But typically, all of those communications should be marshaled through the so-called controller. So that's where really the intellectual property of your app tends to be. And the aesthetics are in the view. And then the model is where we'll do our data typing and our data representation and encapsulation. We'll do a bit of that in just a bit. All right, so that was MVC. And in what form does this take in the world of iOS? Well, in iOS, we have a few classes within UIKit. So this is the API that provides access to UI-related things in iOS. And UI application was a class that we barely spent any time with because we just make a reference to it in main, essentially, where we have a new UI application. And that's the class that embodies your actual application. But beyond that, we don't really need to care too much about it. But UI application delegate is a class that we spent a little more time talking about. And what is that class's role when you create an iOS app? Use it in a sentence that makes it sound like technically you're comfy with what its role is.
Isn't that where you put your code?
So it's where you put your code, or at least the first entry point. You wouldn't put your code in main.m, but rather you might first put it in the UI application delegate. And conceptually, it's to this class, or an object thereof, that control of your application is delegated or passed. So he's now the guy in charge. But as soon as we started doing more interesting applications than just rectangles on the screen and started getting interactions from users, we further delegated control from the UI application delegate to an object of what type? UI view controller. And we don't have to per se. Games don't necessarily use that same class, and custom applications don't necessarily use that class. But the UI view controller is nice because it comes with a whole bunch of built-in functionality for handling various common paradigms like buttons and sliding and tabular views and so forth. So it's a common starting point, certainly for the types of menued applications we've looked at thus far. And a UI view controller, in turn, makes use of a bunches of UI view objects, but typically not just generic UI view objects. What are some subclasses that we've used and talked about? Two of which I've enumerated tonight, albeit off camera. Starts with UI, ends with button. Okay, so UI buttons. So this was just a subclass. And thus far, we've essentially used these things by dragging and dropping. But we did have a quick glimpse last time at nonib.xcode project, which was a re-implementation of that super simple app that gave me a text field for my name, gave me a button to click on to actually then trigger a UI alert view saying, hello, David, or hello, such and such. And we dragged and dropped that UI button, but UI button is just a specific incarnation of UI view. And if you think back to Xcode and think back to Interface Builder, that drag and drop interface, what we're essentially doing by dragging and dropping is dropping these little objects on top of a canvas. And they can overlay, overlay, overlay. And we'll do a little more of that in a different sense tonight by actually responding to arbitrary key presses or pinches for zooms and the like. So we can actually listen to the entire UI view, as we will see. UI window, finally, was a special case of a UI view. It has some additional stuff baked into it that essentially describes the full rectangular area of the iOS device in question. But today, we'll spend a bit more time in UI view controller and UI view, but we'll see those other classes again along the way. So Let's see. So last time, we looked at a whole bunch of these templates. None of these templates are strictly necessary. You could just start with nothing in your project and start writing files by hand. The problem is you just end up reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of configuration details that we saw in the form of property lists, those key value pairs, that would just be a pain to do manually. So Xcode helps jumpstart things either with an empty application, which has the bare minimum of configuration. And then we looked at single view last time. And in lab, you looked at utility view, and you're knee-deep in a utility view application for Evil Hangman. So if we proceed a little further today, let's take a look at these two last ones. Not because they in and of themselves are applications you'll need to use for the project, but rather because they're illustrative of somewhat more complex applications that you might implement that nonetheless assume familiarity with the overall structure we had earlier. So let's do this. First, let's start somewhere simple. I'm going to go into Xcode, and I'm going to first start not with an empty application, which was super uninteresting by the end of last week, but single view application, and then we'll quickly build on from there. I'm going to go ahead and call this single view. I'm going to just store it on my desktop. I'm going to uncheck storyboards here, click next, then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we have the following boilerplate files. So suppose, by contrast, I didn't just create this right in front of you, but you were handed this project from someone else, and you want to wrap your mind as to what's going on inside of it. Where's the best place to start to understand what you've been handed?
In the .h file, viewcontroller.h.
Okay, viewcontroller.h. I would propose that's maybe a little too deep at first glance. Why don't we start where the beginning of the story begins? Yeah, app delegate, and really, if we want to be super anal about this, technically it's main.m that kickstarts the whole process, and a quick glance should at least reassure that there's nothing special, nothing different there, but indeed it's in this file that we see mention not only of UI application, but also app delegate, to whom we're going to delegate control. So we've confirmed that there's nothing distinct in there. So now I would propose among the app delegate files, starting with the .h is probably the better place, because it gives you, in theory, an overview of what's about to go on, and it also gives you a sense of what needs to be implemented in the .m file. So what's going on here? Well, quick recap. The import line does what for us?
It imports the user interface kit.
Okay, good. It imports the user interface kit. And what does that mean? So in that .h file, there's a whole bunch of class declarations, perhaps, maybe a bunch of constants that are defined, a whole bunch of things that we want to take for granted exist. And this is our way of teaching Xcode that we want to use the code that someone else wrote. All right, on the next line, we have @class view controller. Actually, that's a little strange. There's a semicolon, yet no implementation of the class. What is it with this line here, @class view controller, which we've not really spent time on? Yeah?
So the @class actually tells it that it is a class, but it doesn't actually import it.
Exactly.
Unless you were going to use one of its methods, that should suffice to tell it that it exists.
Exactly. So we didn't spend time on this last time, but this is what's called a forward declaration. It's a little hint to the compiler saying there is going to be a class called view controller. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it, but if you see mentions of view controller elsewhere in this file, don't complain. Don't give me any red warning saying that's not allowed. This is just teaching the compiler what's actually going to come. And indeed, where are we using that? Well, a few lines later, we're declaring a property whose purpose in life is to store a pointer to a view controller object. So this is, long story short, in a way of avoiding potential circular references whereby one file might import another, A common paradigm is if you only need to make mention of the class in this way in your .h file, just to use a forward declaration and not to import the whole viewcontroller.h file, for instance. Okay, what's this third, more interesting line saying? @interface, app delegate, UI responder, angled brackets, UI application delegate. Let's start easily. This just declares what? What's this mention in black of app delegate? Name of the class, all right? The UI responder means it's the UI responder is the parent of the class, so app delegate is going to descend from UI responder, and someone else, the UI application delegate in angled brackets? It's a protocol. So we're saying that we are going to implement the UI application delegate protocol, and this makes sense because the class, after all, is called app delegate. All right, what are the two properties? Well, we saw one view controller. We have another pointer to the UI window. That'll give us access to the full rectangular portion of the screen, and that's it. All right, so now let's dive into the M file. All of that is boilerplate. None of that is different from what we saw last week. This file is always a little overwhelming at first glance when you have all of these comments, but that just means they're not really doing anything. So let's ignore anything that's not actually doing anything functional and focus only on this first method up top named, what's the name of this method that remains? Not app delegate, so that's the class name. The name of the method is?
Finish launching with options.
Yeah, application did finish launching with options. So longly named method there, but what's this doing? So first it's allocating a window. It's initializing it with a frame. That's just referring to the rectangle as we keep describing it. View controller gets, so here is where we are effectively configuring our app delegate with another guy to whom we're going to delegate control, the view controller. Self.viewController is a property that's built into the app delegate class. So if you actually look up the documentation for a UI application delegate, you'll see that it comes with that property. So we are setting it in that way. Finally, we're setting this is our property that we declared in the .h file, but it comes with a root view controller property in the window. That's in the UI window documentation. And then that second to last line, make key invisible, just gives control to the UI controller to the foreground. What else does this application do? Anything? So that's it. All we have is a nib where we could start to put our user interface, but beyond that, this application does terribly, terribly little. So let's try to see first. Any questions? So let's take a more complex tour and see if we can't now understand a new application entirely, but this time while thinking about it in the context of applications we've seen thus far. So among tonight's source code is a folder called master detail. This is essentially a simplified version of the standard template that comes with Xcode. So all I did was tidy things up and remove things that didn't need to be there. As usual, let's go into our main.m file. Let me close some superfluous windows over there. Nothing new happening here, so that's the same file we saw earlier. What file should we probably dive into next, following the same rule of thumb? Okay, so app delegate, start with the .h. That looks perfectly the same, so nothing new there. AppDelegate.m, so here we have what seems to be the same code as before, except for any differences? So we're instantiating a master view controller. So that's interesting. It's not just a view controller, it's a master view controller, and we're making it the root view controller, so to speak. So most of this code is the same, but I'm instantiating a different class name, but that's because someone at Apple decided for this template that we're not going to have one view controller implemented for you in .h and .m. We're going to have what appears to be two, master view controller and detail view controller. So at this point, I'm a little puzzled as to what this thing's going to do. So let me go ahead and just run the application and see if we can't then work backwards as to how the behavior we're about to see is functioning. So let me go ahead and foreground the simulator, and in just a moment we'll see it pop to the foreground. Lately the simulator has been loading a little slowly, but there we have it. And now we have, interesting, an application that has nothing going on here. You can just about see the horizontal line. So this is some kind of tabular view going on. And this application, the starting point, is designed just to do something stupid, just to insert a new row every time you click the plus, and it's choosing the timestamp in UTC, so universal time, and adding a row accordingly. So if I do that ad nauseum, we'll just get lots and lots of rows. But you might recall this paradigm in iOS. If I click Edit, I get this familiar UI. I can go ahead and delete, say, that one by clicking that circle, then clicking the delete button. Then I can say Done. And so there we have that functionality. And if I click a row itself, detail view content goes here. So what's just happened, apparently, is that we've made some kind of transition from the master view controller to what they call the detail view controller. So this is illustrative now of how you can hand off control between two view controllers. Recall that you've essentially been doing this in the utility application, or you will soon be doing this in the utility application for Evil Hangman, but you were choosing a different type of transition. Rather than side to side, you were doing front to back flipping. So this one still is a little different in its implementation. Let's next go into, from appdelegate.m, let's start with masterviewcontroller.h. Is there anything of interest in here? So master view controller has a property that's going to store the address of what kind of object? Looks like a detail view controller. So if you think about this high level, the root view controller is the master view controller. He apparently is somehow going to have attached to him the address of a detail view controller. So it seems to be the case indeed that the master view controller is in charge. Now we haven't done any of that wiring yet, so let's go into the .m